The first thing Detective Sergeant Mike Callahan said to me when I walked into the briefing room that Monday morning was, "Hayes, this one's above your pay grade." The second thing he said was, "Sit down and take notes." I sat down. I took notes. And I spent the next 11 weeks proving him wrong in ways that neither of us had anticipated, in ways that eventually made the front page of every major newspaper in the state, and in ways that cost me more than I had budgeted for when I woke up that morning and drove to work with a coffee I hadn't finished and a career I hadn't yet understood the full dimensions of. My name is Officer Cassidy Lane. I was 24 years old. I had been with the Millbrook City Police Department for 14 months. And the case that landed on the conference table that Monday morning was the strangest thing I had ever seen, the strangest thing anyone in that room had ever seen, and as it turned out, the strangest thing the city of Millbrook, Ohio had encountered in 30 years of keeping records. 3 people were connected to the same impossible location at the same hour of the same night. One of them was dead. One of them had no memory of being there. And one of them, according to every database, every record, every official document the department could access, did not exist. That was what the file said. Callahan was right about one thing. It was above my pay grade. I solved it anyway. Millbrook sits in the northeastern corner of Ohio, population 82,000, the kind of city that isn't quite large enough to be anonymous and isn't quite small enough for everyone to know everything. It has a downtown that works, a riverfront that the city has been developing for 15 years in the slow, incrementally improving way of places that are serious about the project without being in a hurry. It has good schools in some neighborhoods and underfunded schools in others, and a police department of 340 officers that ranges, like all departments, from genuinely excellent to genuinely problematic, with a large middle section of people who are doing a reasonable job under conditions that don't always make that easy. I grew up in Millbrook. My mother, Sandra Lane, taught high school chemistry for 23 years at Jefferson High. My father, Ray Lane, owned a small electrical contracting business that employed 6 people and operated on the principle that you showed up when you said you'd show up, and you charged what you said you'd charge, and you did the work right the first time. He applied these principles to everything, not just the business. I was not one of those people who always knew they wanted to be a cop. I went to Ohio State for 2 years studying criminal justice without a strong sense of direction, and then transferred to a smaller program at a state university closer to home, and graduated with a degree in forensic science with a minor in psychology, which turned out to be exactly the combination I needed for the work I ended up doing, though I didn't know that at the time. I joined the Millbrook PD at 22 because I was good at noticing patterns, good at talking to people, and genuinely interested in the space where human behavior and evidence intersected. I was not particularly interested in the hierarchy of the institution or the politics of it or the career advancement mechanics of it. I wanted to work cases. I wanted to be in rooms asking questions and looking at evidence and building the picture that the evidence was pointing toward. My first 14 months were patrol. Standard assignment. Nothing unusual about my record, solid performance reviews, good community feedback, 1 commendation for de-escalation work during a domestic disturbance call that my supervising sergeant wrote up specifically. I was not a standout. I was competent and diligent and 24, which in a department where the average detective had 12 years and meant I was essentially furniture. Detective Sergeant Mike Callahan ran the Major Crimes Unit. He was 51, 23 years in, with the specific self-confidence of a man who has solved enough cases to trust his instincts completely and enough institutional seniority to not be required to explain those instincts to anyone who might question them. He was not a bad detective. He was a good detective who had stopped being curious around year 15, which in a job that rewards curiosity above almost everything else is a particular kind of professional limitation. He had requested a junior officer for administrative support on a caseload that had grown beyond his unit's capacity. I was assigned to him because I was available and because my sergeant thought it would be useful experience. Callahan thought it would be useful for someone to handle his filing and his case documentation and his interview scheduling. We had different ideas about what I was for. It took 11 weeks and 1 solved case to resolve the disagreement. The file that landed on the conference table that Monday morning concerned a man named Gerald Foster, 58, found dead in the basement of an abandoned building on the corner of Clement and Orchard Streets in the industrial corridor on the west side of Millbrook. Found at 5:47 a.m. on Saturday, November 3rd, by a city maintenance crew responding to a reported water main issue in the block. Cause of death, per the preliminary autopsy: cardiac arrest. No obvious evidence of violence. No obvious evidence of forced entry to the building, which had been structurally secured by the city 18 months earlier following a code violation proceeding. No obvious evidence of how Gerald Foster had gotten into the building, or what he had been doing there. Gerald Foster was a retired accountant, divorced, 2 adult children in other states, lived alone in a condominium on the east side of Millbrook. No criminal record. No known connection to the industrial corridor or to the building in which he was found. This was strange. Unexplained deaths of retired accountants in secured abandoned buildings were unusual. But it was not, at first look, the strangest element of the file. The strangest element was what the first responding officers had found when they processed the immediate scene. In the basement of the building, arranged around the body of Gerald Foster with a deliberateness that made the arrangement clearly intentional rather than coincidental, were personal items belonging to 2 other people. The first set of items, a wallet containing ID, credit cards, and $60 in cash, a cell phone, and a set of car keys, belonged to a woman named Patricia Voss, 44, a nurse practitioner who lived on the north side of Millbrook and who, when officers attempted to notify her of the discovery, answered her front door at 7:30 a.m. in her bathrobe, completely unaware that her wallet, phone, and keys were 3 miles away in a basement beside a dead man. Patricia Voss had no explanation for how her belongings had gotten there. She had been home, she said, since 8 p.m. the previous evening. She could not immediately identify anyone who could confirm her presence in her home throughout the night. The second set of items was a single object, a leather-bound journal, well used, initialed on the cover with the letters EW, that contained approximately 200 pages of handwritten entries. The entries were in a distinctive handwriting. They described events, observations, and what appeared to be research notes related to Gerald Foster specifically, over a period of several months. When the department ran the initials EW through every available database, combined with physical descriptions extracted from the journal's content, references to appearance and age that suggested a woman in her late 30s, they found nothing. No matching individual in the Millbrook area. No matching individual in the broader county database. No matching individual in any system they had access to. The journal belonged, as far as the department could determine, to someone who did not officially exist. Callahan's read on the situation, delivered in the briefing with the confidence of someone who has already decided before examining the evidence, was that Gerald Foster had died of a cardiac event while engaged in some kind of unauthorized activity in the building, trespassing at minimum, possibly connected to something he didn't want associated with his home address. The belongings were either planted to complicate the picture or the result of a separate, unrelated incident in the same location. The journal was likely connected to a privacy matter Foster had wanted kept separate from his official life. We run Foster's financials, talk to his kids, close it out as unexplained natural death pending the full autopsy, Callahan said. Hayes, I need the background documentation organized by Wednesday. What about the journal? I asked. We log it as evidence and wait for someone to claim it. The woman the journal is written about, Patricia Voss, she doesn't know why her belongings were there? Says she doesn't, Callahan said. She's not a suspect. She was in her house. Was anyone able to confirm that? A brief pause. Her neighbor reported seeing her car in the driveway at 10 p.m. when he took his dog out. That's not the same as confirming she was inside at. Hayes. Callahan's voice had the specific quality of someone ending a thread rather than continuing it. Wednesday. Documentation. I said yes. I organized the documentation. I also, on my lunch break, read every page of the journal. The journal was 218 pages, written in a small, precise hand that covered every line completely. The ink was consistent, the same pen throughout, or pens of identical type, which suggested the journal had been composed over time as a continuous project rather than in bursts or by multiple contributors. The entries began approximately 8 months before Gerald Foster's death and described, in accumulating detail, a sustained surveillance operation. The writer, who referred to herself in the third person at times as though writing for an audience and first person at other times, in a way that felt like the shift between professional documentation and genuine private reflection, had been observing Gerald Foster. The observations were specific, methodical, and deeply strange. Foster's daily routine was documented with an accuracy that suggested either extended physical surveillance or access to monitoring of some kind. His movements, his contacts, his appointments. But interspersed with this surveillance documentation were passages of a different character entirely, analytical, almost academic, describing patterns in Foster's behavior that connected him to a series of financial transactions the writer had apparently been independently investigating for reasons the journal didn't fully explain. The financial patterns the journal described were complex. I am not an accountant or a financial investigator, and my first read of the relevant passages produced an incomplete picture. But what I understood was this. The journal's author believed that Gerald Foster had been involved over a period of years in the systematic movement of money through a series of shell companies and charitable entities, in amounts and patterns that the author characterized as consistent with money laundering on a significant scale. The author was not, based on everything in the journal, a law enforcement officer. She wrote with the frustration of someone who had brought information to official channels and not been heard, who had decided to build the evidentiary case herself because the official process had failed her in some way she referred to obliquely, but never described specifically. The last entry in the journal was dated the night before Foster's body was found. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described a meeting. The author had, apparently, arranged or attended a meeting with Foster in the basement of the Clement and Orchard building. The second paragraph was an incomplete thought that ended mid-sentence, as though the writing had been interrupted. The third paragraph was 3 words, written in a notably larger and less controlled hand than the rest of the journal. The 3 words were, * he already knew. I sat with the journal closed on my desk for a long time after I finished reading it. He already knew. The meeting in the basement had not gone the way the author expected. Something had happened, or almost happened, or been revealed. And then Gerald Foster had died of cardiac arrest, and the journal had been left beside his body by a woman who, officially, did not exist. I wrote 6 pages of notes. I organized Callahan's documentation by Wednesday as requested, and I started, quietly and without telling anyone, pulling threads. The first thread was Patricia Voss. I requested a second conversation with her, framing it to Callahan as routine follow-up to close the loose end of her belongings at the scene. He approved it without attention. I met Patricia Voss at her home on Thursday afternoon. She was a careful woman, not cold, but measured, in the way of someone who has learned to be precise about what she shares and with whom. She was an MP at a family practice on the north side. She had short dark hair, and the specific quality of attention I recognized from people who spend their professional lives reading subtle signals in other people's behavior. She told me again that she had no idea how her belongings had gotten to the Clement and Orchard building. I listened to this account, and then I asked her, as directly as I could manage, whether she knew Gerald Foster. A pause. Brief but specific. I may have encountered him professionally, she said carefully. I see a large number of patients. Were you treating Gerald Foster? I'm not able to discuss patient relationships. Ms. Voss, I said, your belongings were found beside his body. I'm not asking you to violate confidentiality. I'm asking whether you had a relationship with him outside of any clinical context. Another pause. She looked at her hands. There's a person you should talk to, she said finally. I don't know how to find her, but her name, the name she gave me, was Ellen Warwick. The initials EW. How do you know her? I asked. She came to my practice, Patricia said. 3 months ago. Not as a patient. She came during my lunch hour and asked to speak with me privately. She said she had information about a former patient that she believed I needed to know. What kind of information? Patricia looked at me steadily. The kind that I didn't want to believe, and then spent 3 months trying to decide what to do with. I asked what the information was. She said she wasn't ready to tell me yet. She said she needed to know I was someone she could trust. I told her I understood. I left her my direct number. I told her to call when she was ready. She called 48 hours later. What Patricia Voss told me over the phone, in a conversation I recorded with her consent and transcribed that same evening, reframed the entire case in a way that made Callahan's explanation not just insufficient, but categorically wrong. Gerald Foster had been her patient. Past tense. He had stopped coming to her practice approximately 6 months before his death, following conversation Patricia described as unexpectedly confrontational. He had been presenting with symptoms that she had been managing medically, but which had a profile that, combined with his documented lifestyle and certain anomalies in his reported medical history, had prompted her to order a specific panel of tests that was not standard for his stated profile. The results of those tests had concerned her. She had discussed the results with Foster at his final appointment. He had reacted with controlled but visible alarm, had asked her a series of questions about who had access to the test results and whether they were in the shared medical record system, and had then, at the end of the appointment, told her he would not be returning to the practice and would be transferring his records to another provider. The tests had suggested, among other findings, the presence of a specific compound in his blood work that was not consistent with any of his prescribed medications and not consistent with recreational drug use in any standard pattern. Patricia had flagged it in his chart with a notation for follow-up and had then, when he transferred out, found herself unable to let it go. She had reported the anomaly to the county health department's pharmaceutical monitoring program. She had received a form response acknowledging her report. Nothing else. 2 months later, Ellen Warwick had appeared in her office during lunch. She knew about the test results, Patricia said. I don't know how. She knew the specific compound. She knew the values. She told me she had been trying to document Gerald Foster for months, and that what I had found was the piece she'd been missing. What was the compound? I asked. Patricia gave me the name. I wrote it down. I looked it up that evening, and then I sat at my kitchen table for a long time thinking about what I was looking at. The compound was a pharmaceutical substance that in therapeutic doses treated a specific cardiac condition and in elevated doses produced a specific effect on cardiac function that could, in someone with an underlying vulnerability, precipitate a cardiac event that would present in a standard autopsy as natural death. Gerald Foster, according to his medical records, did not have the cardiac condition this compound was prescribed for. Gerald Foster had died of cardiac arrest. He had not died of natural causes. He had been poisoned. And the woman who had known this, who had documented it, who had arranged a meeting with the man she believed had poisoned someone, the meeting that had ended with 3 words in an uncontrolled hand, was still missing. I brought this to Callahan the following Monday. I presented the timeline, the connection between the test results and the cause of death, the pharmacological information, and the significance of the journal in the context of a suspected poisoning rather than a natural death. Callahan listened. His expression moved through skepticism towards something more guarded and less readable. You're saying Foster was murdered, he said. I'm saying the medical evidence is consistent with deliberate poisoning and inconsistent with natural death. I'm saying the journal suggests the author knew this and that the meeting in the basement was related to her investigation of it. And I'm saying we have a missing woman whose belongings were deliberately placed at a scene and who may be in danger. The autopsy came back natural causes, he said. The standard tox panel doesn't test for this compound. I said. I checked. It would require a supplemental panel specifically ordered. A pause. I need to request a supplemental tox panel on Foster samples, I said. And I need to open the missing persons inquiry for Ellen Warwick. Callahan leaned back in his chair. Based on an anonymous journal. Based on a journal found at the scene of a death that the medical evidence now suggests may be a homicide, with contents that provide a documented investigative record consistent with that theory. Hayes. He looked at me with the specific patience of a man who is trying to be kind while also being dismissive. You've been here 14 months. I've been doing this for 23 years. You've taken a natural death with some odd circumstances and built a homicide theory out of it because a journal got your imagination going. I'd like to request the supplemental tox panel, I said. That's a standard procedure when new information suggests the original cause of death finding may be incomplete. I'll take it under advisement. Sir, if there's a missing woman. We don't have a missing woman. We have someone who left a journal at a scene. She's not reported missing by anyone, because she doesn't officially exist, which is itself. Advisement, Hayes. I said yes, sir. I went back to my desk. I sat with the file for a long time. Then I did something that was either the best professional decision I'd made in 14 months or the worst, and I didn't know which for several weeks. I called the county medical examiner directly. Dr. Renee Abra had been Millbrook County's chief medical examiner for 7 years and had a reputation in the department as someone who was rigorous, independent, and not particularly interested in having her findings managed by operational priorities. I had met her once at a training session on evidence collection procedures, and she had struck me as someone who asked the question that was in front of her rather than the question that was convenient. I called her on her direct line, identified myself, and told her I had information suggesting the supplemental toxicological workup on Gerald Foster should include testing for a specific compound I named. I told her the basis for my suspicion. I told her that a formal request through the department's chain had not yet been approved. She was quiet for a moment. "You're calling me directly because the formal request hasn't moved," she said. It was not a question. "I'm calling you because the information I have suggests time may be a factor," I said, specifically with respect to a missing person who may have been present at the scene. Another pause. "I'll initiate the supplemental panel on my own authority," she said. "I have the discretion to do that when new information suggests my initial findings may be incomplete. Results in 4 to 6 days." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "If the panel comes back clean, you'll have gone over your supervisor's head for nothing, and you'll need to deal with that." "I know," I said. "And if it doesn't come back clean," she said, "you'll have a different set of problems." She was right on both counts. The supplemental panel came back in 5 days. The compound was present, at a level that Dr. Abra, in the report she filed with the department that same afternoon, characterized as consistent with intentional administration at a dose sufficient to precipitate cardiac arrest in an individual with the underlying vulnerability documented in Gerald Foster's medical history. Gerald Foster had been murdered. The report landed on Callahan's desk at 3 p.m. on a Thursday. I was at my desk when he came out of his office and crossed the room and stood in front of me for a moment without speaking, in the way of someone who is processing several things simultaneously and working out which one to address first. He addressed the professional one first. "You called Abra directly?" "Yes, sir." "Without authorization?" "You had taken the supplemental request under advisement. The information I had suggested time was a factor in a potential missing person situation. I made a judgment call." "You made an unauthorized contact that circumvented my authority on an active case?" "Yes, sir." "I did." He looked at me. I held the look. We both understood what was in front of us, a case that had just become a homicide and a junior officer who had been right about it when her supervisor had been wrong, and the specific institutional awkwardness of that combination. "The missing person," he said finally. "Ellen Warwick. Initials EW. Consistent with the journal. Female. Estimated late 30s based on journal content. No official records in any accessible database." "How does someone have no records?" "Deliberately constructed absence," I said. "A background that's been professionally erased, which is its own significant data point. She knew enough about the situation to understand she needed to be invisible while she was investigating it." He was quiet for a moment. "What's your theory?" he said. And for the first time, he said it like a man who was actually asking rather than a man who was tolerating a junior officer's enthusiasm. "Foster was poisoned by someone who had ongoing access to him, close enough to administer a compound over time, not in a single dramatic dose, but in an accumulated pattern that would eventually produce a cardiac event that looked natural. The journal suggests this was part of a larger pattern connected to financial crimes. Ellen Warwick discovered this through independent investigation and arranged a meeting with Foster, possibly to confront him, possibly to give him an opportunity to cooperate with something. At that meeting he told her something he already knew," she wrote. "She may have been in danger at the scene. She may have fled, or she may have been taken. Who poisoned Foster?" "I don't know yet," I said. "But the journal contains 8 months of financial documentation. Someone who can actually read that documentation will find the answer." "You're not a financial investigator." "No," I said, "but I know someone who is." My father's accountant, a woman named Margaret Chen who had handled his business finances for 15 years, was not a forensic accountant, but she knew one, a former colleague named David Park, who had spent 8 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit before going private. She made the introduction the following morning over a phone call she placed without being asked, because that's the kind of person my mother's kitchen table produces. David Park reviewed the financial sections of the journal over a weekend. He called me Sunday evening with findings delivered in the measured, specific language of someone who has been inside complex financial crime cases and understands exactly what he's looking at. The journal was describing a real scheme. The shell companies, the charitable entities, the movement patterns. Park recognized the structural approach from cases he had worked. The money involved was significant. The scheme had been operating for years. And the person the journal identified as the architect of the scheme was not Gerald Foster. Foster had been a participant. A knowing one, well compensated, but a participant rather than the designer. The designer, according to the journal's documentation, was a man named Howard Aldrich, 62, who was the chief financial officer of a regional healthcare network headquartered in Millbrook. A man whose name appeared regularly in the city's business press alongside words like respected and community leader. A man who had, based on the pattern the journal documented, arranged Foster's death when Foster had become a liability. Howard Aldrich also had a wife who was a nurse practitioner. Not Patricia Voss. A different woman, named Karen Aldrich, who had access to pharmaceutical supplies through her professional role and who had, the journal noted with the accumulating certainty of someone who has followed evidence to its conclusion, been Foster's medical contact for a period of approximately 18 months. Not as his provider, as the person administering the compound. I sat with this for an hour. Then I did what the situation required. I called Callahan at home on a Sunday evening and told him everything. The next 72 hours were the most professionally consequential of my career and also the most genuinely frightening. Callahan moved the case to major crimes full status and brought in 2 additional detectives, both significantly more experienced than me, both initially skeptical of the theory and then progressively less so as the evidence mounted. He also, to his credit, did not attempt to remove me from the case. He assigned me to the evidence coordination role, which was technically junior, but which, given that I was the only person who had read the entire journal and understood its structure, functionally meant I was in every room where the case was being built. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was notified, given the scale and nature of the scheme David Park had identified. 2 federal agents joined the investigation by Tuesday morning. They had the authority to access financial records that the department's state process could not reach quickly, and what they found in those records over 48 hours confirmed the journal's documentation with the specific weight of official evidence. Howard Aldrich was building a case he couldn't manage when he heard the department was reinvestigating Foster's death. On Wednesday evening, Ellen Warwick walked into the Millbrook PD's front desk and asked to speak with whoever was running the Foster case. She was 39, medium height, with the specific quality of someone who has been moving carefully and watching everything for a long time and has decided, in this moment, that the moving carefully is over. She had a bruise on her left forearm that she explained as a fall, which none of us believed, and which she did not press. She had been, she told us, in the city the entire time, staying with a contact she refused to name, having realized after the night of the meeting that she was in immediate danger, and having chosen to remain invisible until the investigation had moved to a point where her testimony would have more protection than her absence. She had, she told us, been following the case's development through a source inside the department she also declined to name. She was, in person, exactly what the journal had suggested, methodical, precise, and in possession of the complete evidentiary picture that she had spent 8 months building and that she now presented to us in a 4-hour session with her attorney present, transferring everything she knew from her own unauthorized investigation into the official record where it could do the work it had been built to do. She had been a financial auditor, she told us. She had worked for a regulatory consulting firm that had been engaged to review the healthcare network's finances 3 years earlier. She had found the anomalies. She had reported them to her supervisor. Her supervisor had reported them upward. 2 weeks later, she had been let go from the firm under circumstances framed as a restructuring. She had spent 3 years trying to get someone official to look at what she'd found. She had filed regulatory complaints. She had contacted the FBI's white-collar crime tip line twice. She had hired an attorney who had sent letters to 3 oversight bodies. Nothing had moved. She had decided to build the case herself and find a way to force the system to look at it. "The meeting with Foster," I said. "What happened?" She looked at her hands briefly. "He told me he knew who I was before I said anything. He'd been told I was asking questions. He told me the people involved would know I had the journal if anything happened to him." She paused. "He wasn't threatening me.
He was warning me."
He was scared. He had realized he was next. He knew someone was going to kill him. He'd been experiencing cardiac symptoms for weeks. He had figured out what was in his system. He came to that meeting to tell someone what he knew, not to be confronted by me. Why the basement? Why that building? "It was his choice of location," she said. "He chose a place that wasn't connected to either of us."
She paused.
"He died during the meeting. His heart stopped. I tried to help him. I called 911 from a burner phone and left before they arrived because I knew if I was connected to his death before the evidence was in official hands, the whole thing would be managed as a murder by the unknown woman rather than a murder by Howard Aldrich." She had left her journal deliberately. She had taken Patricia Voss's belongings from a bag Foster had brought to the meeting. Foster had somehow obtained them as what he described as collateral evidence against Karen Aldrich's access to him, and arranged them so that the scene would generate questions that wouldn't be easy to close without investigation. She had been betting on someone asking the right questions. "How did you know someone would?" I asked. "I didn't," she said. "I hoped." Howard Aldrich was arrested on a Thursday morning at the headquarters of the healthcare network, in a conference room where he had been attending a board meeting. 2 federal agents and Callahan handled the arrest. I was not present. I was in an interview room with Karen Aldrich, who had been brought in separately and who, upon being confronted with the pharmaceutical evidence and the financial records and the specific timeline the combined investigation had produced, made the decision that her attorney apparently recommended, and her own calculation apparently confirmed, that cooperation was the better path. Her statement took 3 hours. It was comprehensive and, once she had decided to give it, delivered with the specific clarity of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and is willing to set it down at significant personal cost. She confirmed the administration of the compound. She confirmed that Howard had instructed her to begin the process when Foster had started asking questions about the scheme's exposure risk. She confirmed the timeline, the method, the access she had used. She also told us something that Ellen Warwick had not known. Howard Aldrich had known about Ellen Warwick's investigation for 4 months. He had sources inside the regulatory consulting firm she had worked for. He had known about her journal. He had arranged for people to follow her. And the night of the meeting in the Clement and Orchard basement, when Foster had gone to that meeting and died before anyone could do anything about it, Aldrich had sent 2 people to that location to ensure the meeting's outcome was managed. They had arrived after the ambulance. They had seen Ellen Warwick leaving the building and had followed her. She had lost them in the North End, in a neighborhood she apparently knew well, and had gone to ground. He was going to have her killed, Karen Aldrich said, in the flat tone of someone stating a fact they have made peace with. After Foster died, he decided she was the remaining exposure. I sat with that for a moment. "But she came forward anyway," I said.
Karen looked at me.
"She took the risk because someone was finally asking the right questions," she said. That's what she told her attorney. She was watching the investigation, and she saw someone asking the questions that would make the evidence mean something. I thought about Monday morning, Callahan's briefing.
"Sit down and take notes."
The right questions, asked by someone whose supervisor thought they were there to organize his filing. Howard Aldrich was charged federally on financial fraud, conspiracy, and murder for hire. Karen Aldrich was charged as an accessory to murder and entered a cooperation agreement. The 2 individuals who had been sent to the Clement and Orchard building were identified through cell phone tower data and Karen's cooperation and charged with conspiracy. The scheme, a 7-year operation moving approximately $14 million through the healthcare network's charitable foundation structure, was documented in federal filings that became public record approximately 4 months after the arrest. Ellen Warwick's civil lawsuit against her former employer, filed the day after Aldrich's arrest, alleged wrongful termination in retaliation for her original audit findings. It settled 18 months later on terms that her attorney described as significant. Patricia Voss gave a statement to the department that was thorough and honest, and that she had clearly been preparing to give since the moment she had decided I was someone she could trust. Her information about Foster's medical history was, she told me in a brief conversation after her formal statement, something she had needed to tell someone for months and hadn't known how. How did you decide? I asked her. That you could trust me?
She thought about it.
You came back, she said. You asked the follow-up question. Most people ask the first question and accept the answer that makes the situation manageable. You ask the one after that. Callahan did not, to his credit, attempt to rewrite the case's history once its resolution was public. He acknowledged at the internal review that my initial theory had been correct and that he had underestimated the significance of the evidence I'd presented. He said this in a room of 8 people with the specific discomfort of a man who is being honest at personal cost, which is a form of honesty I respect. He also filed a commendation for my performance on the case, which was specific, detailed, and sent to the department's promotions review board along with a recommendation that I be considered for the detective track ahead of the standard timeline. I was offered a detective assignment 7 months later. I took it. On the day I cleared out my patrol desk for the last time, Callahan stopped by. He didn't say much. He stood there for a moment and then said, "You were right about the journal." "Yes, sir," I said. "For what it's worth," he said, "I was wrong about what you could do." "Thank you for saying that," I said. "And for the commendation." He nodded. He walked away. That was the complete conversation, which was the right length for what it was. Ellen Warwick and I have stayed in contact. She is not in Millbrook now. She moved to another city and has continued working in financial audit for a different firm with a different risk profile than the one that cost her the last position. She calls every few months. We talk about cases. She has a clarity about financial crime patterns that is genuinely useful to the work I do now, and I have, apparently, a clarity about investigative process that she finds useful in the consulting work she does. She told me once, when I asked why she had spent 3 years building a case by herself after the official channels failed her, that she had been raised to believe that if something was wrong and you were the person who had seen it, the fact of having seen it made you responsible for what you did with the knowledge. "You could have stopped," I said. "At any point. After the firm fired you. After the FBI tip line went nowhere. After Aldrich sent people to follow you." "Yes," she said. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I had the journal," she said. "The evidence was real. The scheme was real. The harm was real. Money that was supposed to fund patient care was funding Howard Aldrich's retirement accounts. Gerald Foster was a person who was going to die, and did die because he knew too much. All of that was real, and I had documented it, and putting it down would not have made it unreal. It would have just meant that the real thing had no witness." I thought about Clement and Orchard, the basement, the arranged items, the 3 words at the end of the journal. "You left the journal so someone would ask questions," I said. "I left it so the right person would ask questions," she said. "I just didn't know who that would be." I am 24 years old. I am a detective with the Millbrook Police Department. I've been doing this work for 14 months plus 11 weeks, and I know, with the clarity of someone who has just learned something large, that I am at the very beginning of understanding what I'm actually capable of. The case taught me things I couldn't have learned from training or from patrol shifts or from anything except doing the work at the level the work required. It taught me that the evidence tells a story that exists independent of what anyone needs it to say, and that your job is to be the person who is actually listening to it rather than the person who is waiting to confirm what they already think. It taught me that asking the follow-up question, the question after the one that gets an acceptable answer, is the most important skill a detective has. It taught me that the people who have information don't always bring it to you. Sometimes they need to believe first that you'll know what to do with it. It taught me that being 24 and junior and female in a department where that combination is not historically valued is a liability in exactly the ways I expected, and an asset in ways I hadn't anticipated, that people who are dismissed don't get managed, and that not being managed left me room to actually work. My grandmother, who lives in Millbrook and who I have dinner with every Sunday, Asked me on the Sunday after the arrest whether the case had been what I expected when I started it. No, I said. Was it what you trained for? Parts of it were, I said. Other parts were just following what the evidence was pointing at. She nodded. That's what good work is, she said. Being willing to follow the thing past the point where it gets complicated. She asked me what the strangest moment had been. I thought about it. The journal, I said. Reading it the first time. Understanding that someone had spent 8 months building a case that nobody official would look at and had found a way to make the case visible anyway. She trusted someone would be paying attention, my grandmother said. Yes, I said. And you were? Yes. She poured more coffee. Outside her kitchen window, the neighborhood was doing what it did on Sunday evenings. Quiet, inhabited, the specific warm life of a place where people know each other. I watched it for a moment. The case file is closed now. The evidence is in the federal record. The journal that started it all, 218 pages of small, precise handwriting, building toward a truth that one person's 8 months of invisible work had uncovered and one person's Monday morning of asking the follow-up question had turned into a case, is in the official evidence archive. But I made a copy, not because I need it, because it is the most thorough piece of investigative documentation I have encountered in my professional life, produced by someone working alone, without authority, without institutional support, without any guarantee that anyone would ever read it. It is a reminder of what the work actually requires. Not rank, not seniority, not the particular confidence of a man who has been doing this for 23 years and has stopped being curious. Just the willingness to follow the evidence past the point where it gets complicated. And the knowledge, the absolute, settled knowledge, that complicated is exactly where the truth lives.